This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Practical for Your Practice. I'm Andy Santinello, and as usual, I've got Dr. Kevin Holloway here with me. You want to say hello, Kevin?
Hey, everybody. Glad to have you with us.
And we are excited and honored to have Dr. Ryan Warner with us today on the podcast. How you doing, Dr. Warner?
Doing great. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yes. So I am Dr. Ryan C. Warner. I'm a licensed psychologist, researcher, speaker, and consultant. I'm also the founder and CEO of RC Warner Consulting, in which we provide leadership development, diversity, as well as wellness enhancement for organizations and Fortune 500 companies around the globe. I'm really passionate about diversity and inclusion. I'm passionate about promoting wellness within marginalized groups. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk more about diversity and specifically microaggressions, another topic that I'm interested and passionate about.
And we're extremely thankful you made the time for us today. I know you're a very busy man, and you're doing a lot of really important work. And so we are really excited to have the opportunity to chat with you about microaggressions in clinical practice.
Oh, and give a background. So I've worked with a lot of different populations. Currently, I work with active duty as well as veterans, conducting psychotherapy as well. It's important to note that statements of fact and opinion today are expressive of myself and not of any other represented entity. And I really enjoy working with, the veteran active duty population, conducting like trauma work, also, working on like substance use as well. So I'm really excited to collaborate with you all today to specifically help enhance this particular population.
It's definitely a population that's near and dear to our hearts too. That's the work we do as well. And so, yeah, we're right there with you.
Yeah. Both Kevin and I we have backgrounds in trauma and PTSD treatment. In fact, we're two of the PTSD subject matter experts at the center. So it's interesting. We all kind of have a little bit of background on that too.
Cool.
So you mentioned microaggressions, and that's a term that I think is maybe a bit more familiar than it used to be for folks in our field. But I thought maybe a place we could start is with a good definition of microaggressions. So how would you define microaggressions?
Yeah, so I would define microaggressions as subtle, covert forms of discrimination that impact marginalized populations. Okay, so microaggressions I look at as like little mosquito bites. You get one mosquito bite, you brush it off. You're going through throughout the day, live your life. But when you get another mosquito bite and another one and another one in the same location over and over and over again, then it becomes to be impactful, right, to your well-being. So these subtle forms of discrimination could be verbal, they could be nonverbal as well, they can be environmental, et cetera. And ultimately, research shows that they have, significant impact on certain groups, whether that be individuals of different gender statuses or religious backgrounds or racial ethnic identities, et cetera. So, I'd be interested in talking more about that today.
So it's interesting that you gave us some different categories that they might show up in: verbal and nonverbal and environmental. I'm curious if you could give us maybe some examples of each of those, and not that they're meant to be exhaustive, but maybe to illustrate for us what those different kinds might be.
Sure. So I can just provide some personal examples. So I identify as a Black male. And as a Black male, throughout my education from microaggressions, from my supervisors, from other psychologists, from other mental health professionals. So one microaggression I constantly receive, you can't see how tall I am, but I'm about 6'4" or so. And ultimately, I've had supervisors in a clinical setting throughout different rotations during my schoolwork. They say, "Oh, well, I'm surprised that you're not a basketball player."
Mm.
And I would look at them like, "What do you mean? So I can't be a young Black PhD student?" And I've heard multiple times, "Oh, well, you don't look like you're a PhD student." So little things like that, like it wasn't meant to probably hurt me or intentionally harm me, but those things have an impact on my well-being when I experience it over and over and over again, especially by individuals in the mental health profession, right? So that's like a verbal microaggression example. A nonverbal could be, going to your psychotherapist and seeing that no one on their wall looks like you. So, for instance, if you identify as an Asian American male or Asian female, whatever that may be, and you look on the wall for your therapist, you only see pictures of white men, right? Then you may not feel that as included, right? And you may not feel as comfortable in that setting, right? Or maybe you see a Confederate flag, for instance, and ultimately, you may be offended by that, right? So there's a lot of different, examples that come to mind, but those are the ones that I've seen patients convey to me. When they came to my office and they indicated that they saw someone of different racial ethnic background than them, and they didn't feel as comfortable, talking to them about their challenges, due to these environmental and verbal microaggressions that they experience.
And it's not just like a one individual one all by itself, standalone, but as you're saying, it's kind of that collection, that additive nature of all these things together. That can be relevant. I guess the reason I say that is not in any way to try to excuse any individual microaggression. I think probably all of us in one capacity or another has perhaps been guilty of doing one of those things. And it's not that individual one thing, we need to just fix that one thing and all things are fixed, but consider just the whole totality of all those things together.
Definitely. Yeah. And I'm not sure about you all, but I know multiple times I've experienced, I've committed microaggressions, mistakenly, whether it be like a gender microaggression, for instance, assuming if I go out on a double date with one of my friends, assuming that my male friend is going to pay for the bill instead of, his spouse, his fiance, right? Or his wife, right? So little things like that, I know that it's important to, number one, have that awareness, that you're making a mistake, and it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah.
No one wants to be racist or sexist, et cetera. And ultimately, if we're able to just be more aware of the biases that we may hold, then we can enhance our relationships with others, and we can be able to help our clients and patients better as well.
I think that's one of the things that makes this particular topic hard to talk about, because so many clinicians, and I'm going to put myself in this camp too, the first thing that maybe comes to mind is, well, this kind of binary way of looking at it. Like either you're a good, non-racist, non-microaggressing person or you're not. And the focus then almost, to me, it's fear-based. It almost becomes, well, I don't want to make those types of mistakes. So how do I avoid making them at all ever? Right. And listening to your recent webinar with us and reading some of your blog posts, one of the things that you tend to emphasize is we all have bias. And you mentioned that awareness piece as being really important, and approaching this issue, with the expectation that you do have biases, and very likely you have done microaggressions and you might do them again. And being aware of those things and open to it is probably a better starting place than how do we just never do it? Or how do we prove to ourselves we're not quote unquote racist or bad?
And it's important to know that as someone who may commit a microaggression, it is not up to us to decide if that's a microaggression or not. Right. Okay, that's really important. It's up to the individual that perceived, that remark or that, environment, et cetera, that's a microaggression. And that's what makes it very tricky, right? Because it's subjective. You could take two people from very similar backgrounds and they can experience the same type of event. And one may perceive it as a microaggression and one may not, right? So it gets kind of tricky, but I know that there's ways in which we can tell if maybe something we said or we did is offensive. I know, for instance, when I made that mistake recently when I went out on a double date and I just assumed that my male friend would pay for the bill when we would pay their half of the bill when we went out at a restaurant. I saw the face of his fiance, And she gave me a nonverbal cue, like, oh, why did you, give that bill to him, right? So I was able to recognize, hey, I think I made a mistake. And then I was able to engage in that dialogue with her about that, right? So there are ways that we can tell, because a lot of individuals, I know when I experienced microaggressions, sometimes I didn't feel comfortable coming forth and saying, hey, what you said, what you did, I didn't appreciate, because there's different power and privileges, right? So for instance, a couple of years ago when I was a student, a PhD student, I didn't feel comfortable going to my supervisor and indicating that, hey, what you said, what you did, I felt it was offensive, because that's the person that signs off on my hours, right, to graduate, right? So there's different barriers when it comes to individuals, conveying that, hey, that I didn't like what you did. But that's why it's up to us to enhance our awareness about the biases that we may hold.
I think that's such an important point. And not that you didn't, you did a fantastic job of expressing it, but just for my purpose of kind of consolidating it in my head is that, well, that's not what I meant isn't an okay response, right? Like you said, it really is up to the person's personal perception of whether or not it's a microaggression, not the person who maybe did it. And so, it's important to be cultivating that awareness, that sensitivity, that we can step outside of what we meant and recognize how what we're doing is impacting another person, and think about how we can adjust that, about how what we're doing or what we're saying or not doing or saying is landing on another person, not just, well, they just need to know what I meant by that.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a lot in your last response that I think is important to highlight. One of the things that you were talking about, kind of a personal example in a non-clinical setting, and sort of paying attention to and being aware of maybe indications, nonverbal indications, maybe that you have done something that would be a microaggression. Do you have any thoughts about, for clinicians in a clinical setting where there is that power differential, maybe several layers of it, cultural, but also, patient, client, or supervisor, supervisee? What are some of the things that clinicians might want to cultivate in their efforts to become more aware of potentially noticing if perhaps a microaggression has occurred?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So number one, I feel that as culturally, I don't like to use the word culturally competent, but more culturally aware providers, we need to be comfortable engaging in dialogue about culture within a therapeutic setting. Okay. So I'm not sure about you all, but I can think of the last 10 patients that I saw in the last few weeks. And I'll say in 90% of those sessions, some form of culture came up, whether that be military rank, whether that be their gender background, their religious background, political views, et cetera, right? Culture is always, embedded within the therapeutic setting. And according to APA guidelines, as providers that are trying to do no harm, as providers that are trying to best meet the needs of our patients, it is imperative that we understand and try to understand, try to improve our knowledge about the cultural backgrounds of others, right? So number one, we need to enhance our muscles around speaking and engaging in a dialogue about culture in a therapeutic setting. And that way, when we're more comfortable, now we can engage in dialogue. So for instance, if I made a mistake, in therapy, and maybe, for instance, I assumed that someone was a heterosexual male, and maybe they identified, as a gay male instead. If I made that mistake about not asking that person about how they identify, then I can have that dialogue with them and say, hey, I realize that I assume that you were married to someone of the opposite sex, but I realized that your language around it didn't line up with that. So let's talk about that. I feel that I made a mistake, and ultimately, how do you feel about that? And then we can go back and forth. We say, hey, I get that all the time. Individuals assume that I'm a straight male, but identify as a gay male. And that can be really hard for me, because I feel that, I'm trapped, in this domain in which I don't feel as comfortable, right? And I can't really be myself. So this was a conversation I just recently, had with one of my patients. about their sexual identity. And ultimately, I was able to learn from him. And I was able to admit that I made a mistake. And we were able to improve our therapeutic alliance after we had that dialogue, right? Because a lot of therapists feel that we're going to rupture therapeutic alliance if we engage in that discussion. But actually, research shows that it strengthens that cultural that cultural alliance. When we're being vulnerable as providers, when we can admit that, hey, we don't have all the answers, and hey, we make mistakes too.
Mm-hmm. And even modeling that in a way too, that
yes,
I love what you're saying. It reminds me too that, we're engaging with folks clinically. We're talking about all sorts of uncomfortable things all the time. And we get real personal and real intimate all the time. And yet there are some of those topics that feel like we shouldn't go there because we might say something wrong, or it's going to feel weird and awkward and uncomfortable, as you said. And I love how you describe that too. Like, we kind of need to get comfortable with the discomfort, right? Like, we need to get comfortable with the idea that we're going to sometimes say things, and we need to be open about approaching that.
Yes. And I can also speak on the opposite lens as well. So as a provider, I want to be able to enhance my well-being. So I see a provider as well, for my mental health and my mental well-being. And this individual that I see identifies as a white female. And I really appreciate how I'm able to talk about, my experience as a Black male. And she tells me, hey, I can't really, I don't know how it feels to be a Black male. I can't imagine what you've been going through, but ultimately I'm here for you, and I'm here to learn more about your experience. So when she was able to convey that to me, I felt that, I belonged in that therapeutic setting. I felt that she really tried to listen to me and my experiences. And ultimately, we need more providers to do that.
Yeah, that willingness to even just engage in the conversation. Whether it's acknowledging that something didn't go the way that they had intended and there has been a rupture, or just, kind of being obvious and owning your own background and how that might be different, and being in the habit of having those conversations, making it something that you do on a regular basis. And, you mentioned getting more comfortable, and I'm guessing that's one of the ways that you might suggest doing that, just making a habit of getting in these conversations. Do you have other thoughts about how clinicians who want to improve, their ability to, address these issues can get more comfortable?
Number one, we need to engage in psychoeducation, right? Mm-hmm. So not just going to one diversity training every year, but trying to enhance our knowledge, maybe reading new books that we never have read before, or watching different TED Talks or YouTube videos, right? Or also spending time with individuals different than ourselves. So for instance, I urge the listeners right now to reflect on who you follow on Instagram or Facebook and, social media. Are they the people who belong to the same social identities that you belong to? Are they the same people in your same career or have similar ideologies and ways of thinking? If so, it's time to branch out. It's time to follow new people. It's time to spend time with others so you can learn from their cultural background, so you can be more culturally aware. Okay. So psychoeducation, engaging, with other cultures, and also being able to implement different theoretical frameworks that could be helpful as well. So if you would like me to talk more about that, I can maybe give the listeners a specific framework that they can follow, to engage in cultural dialogue with their patients, as well as with their coworkers.
I would love for you to talk about that. And before we jump into that, just one of the things that struck me about your answer is you mentioned a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind. Engaging not just in reading research articles about multiculturalism and cultural competency, but actually getting out and experiencing and participating in other cultures. Getting to know and being around folks who are different than you, rather than just continuing to be in that kind of echo chamber, social media created echo chamber, or even just your life where you're only seeing people of the same culture. So it's really going beyond the boundaries of professionally what you're kind of looking at, but actually in your personal life, making the effort to put yourself in situations where you're going to be around people who are different and having conversation with people that are different. And so I thought that was especially important, because often I think the focus is, getting more education within your profession or your continuing education versus doing that in your personal life.
I got a confession.
And that's hard. That's hard too.
It is hard. It can, it can certainly be tricky because I think, just as you mentioned people tend to follow, like on social media, follow people who are like them, or they grow up in a culture and live around people who are like them. So it's going to take some effort. And if this is something that matters to you, putting in that effort and maybe going outside your comfort zone, actually, that's what it's going to require. Absolutely going outside your comfort zone.
And it's funny. I was going to say, I have this confession to make, is that as you started to talk about social media, my mind first immediately went to, okay, who am I friends with that I need to cut out? And, and as in, who do I have connections with in social media who are perhaps less committed to tolerance and inclusion and diversity? And it was this moment of like, okay, that's something I need to look at too in myself. It isn't about cutting out necessarily. I mean, there's room for that, but expanding, including more, going and connecting with more people who have, different ways of seeing the world and themselves and their communities and that. So there's my little confession for the day. As you started to go there, my first thought was, how do I reduce rather than expand? And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, definitely. That's great.
So you mentioned a model that clinicians may be able to use in addition to some of the suggestions you've already made. So would you be willing to tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm, definitely. So this model was created by Dr. Dana Crawford. She's a psychologist. And ultimately, it's a framework to help us to move from awareness to concrete action. So we may engage in a lot of dialogue about how we can create more diverse workplaces and more inclusive therapeutic settings. But how do we actually implement that, day to day? So this model is called the Let Up model. And it's an acronym, and I'll go through each word. Ultimately, Let Up stands for listen, empathize, tell your story, understand, and psychoeducate. Okay. So, for instance, if we experience, a triggering event, or maybe we hear something that just doesn't sit right with us, maybe in our workplace, or, maybe a client conveys to us, or we may convey to the client, et cetera. Implementing the Let Up model could be helpful with engaging in productive dialogue around culture, around diversity. Okay. So let up the first listen. Okay. So if a colleague has made a statement about like a particular group, that you have deep emotional connections with, and maybe you experience a visceral reaction, with that. Ultimately, we have to first listen, because what we tend to do as human beings, we tend to shut down. We tend to put up, a shield. We tend to be defensive at first, right? But we need to be aware of that, and we need to first just listen to their experiences. Okay, so I'll try to give an example to guide us through. So I guess I'll think of a recent example. When I was in school a couple of years ago, and a supervisor conveyed to me, she told me I was working in a maximum security prison for a rotation that I was doing. And as one of the only Black male staff members there, I realized nobody on staff looked like me. They were all white males and white females. But all the inmates, or all the individuals who were incarcerated, looked like me. They were all Black males. And I remember that I was in the office setting, and I was just talking with one of my peer students or peer interns. And my supervisor came out of nowhere, and she said, "Ryan, stop using inmate language," when I was speaking to one of my peers. And so I guess I was using a term that she felt that wasn't professional. I didn't say a curse word or anything like that. It wasn't in front of a patient. I was just being myself. I was just having an informal conversation in the office. And when she told me stop using inmate language, that made me, defensive at first. But implementing the Let Up model, I first tried to listen. I tried to understand, where she came from. Okay. So listening is not just, verbal listening, but also listening to my internal processing. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I realized physiologically, my heart started to beat fast. I started to, become very angry and frustrated. Right. I noticed this internal visceral reaction. Okay. After I listened, I then implemented the E, which is empathize. Okay. So regardless how I felt about that statement, it's important that I try to sit in her shoes and empathize with her. Okay. So in this particular situation, I was the first Black male in a long time that worked in this particular setting. So maybe she didn't realize, what she said to me. Next, we had informal conversations before, and she indicated that she grew up in an all-white neighborhood, and she didn't have that many interactions with Black males until she actually started working in the prison. So I started to look in her shoes. Okay, maybe she just didn't realize how impactful that statement or offensive that statement was, to another Black male, myself, right? So after I listened and empathized, I then was able to implement the T, which is tell your story. Okay, so I was able to build up the courage to speak with her later that day. And I was able to tell my story about how constantly I've experienced these ongoing microaggressions within my educational experiences. And ultimately, I wanted to learn more about what she meant about that state. Okay. So I was able to implement self-disclosure, which we know is helpful, with building alliance, and that was helped her be able to realize where I came from. And then I was able to implement the U, which is understand. Okay. So it's important that, I myself, try to engage in additional cultural awareness of other groups, so for instance, learn more about like the white identity development model, understand more about, hey, she just may not have been aware of that particular statement. And it's okay, and I was able to ultimately psychoeducate her, the last P, which is psychoeducate. I was able to implement psychoeducation regarding how I felt that was kind of offensive, and I felt, a visceral reaction when she said that statement. And then we were able to engage in that dialogue about, hey, I didn't realize what I said, impacted you so much. I try to be more aware of those type of things, in the future. So that was a productive, conversation that I had with my supervisor, and we were able to, improve our relationship, in the future, and have additional discussions about, bias and racism and, the correction system, systemic racism, et cetera, in the future, because I was able to implement that let up model. So that's just an example about how it can be implemented within practice. And I gave an example with a supervisor, but you can also implement that let up model with patients or with coworkers, et cetera, to engage in productive and meaningful dialogue.
And what strikes me about it, the model is, I love the different steps to it. And what strikes me about it is there's the initial delay, the awareness, so not necessarily reacting, but taking a moment to not only just acknowledge to yourself that this occurred, but also really checking in with yourself and kind of notice your internal dialogue, your feelings, your physiological reactions. There's that moment of awareness and then engagement after that in several different steps, which seems really critically important.
Yes, if anyone's ever interested in learning more about the model, all you have to do is Google, Dr. Crawford let up model, and, her research article should come right up.
You read my mind, because I was going to ask you about that. And certainly we can include some of those links and resources in our show notes so that our listeners can do some more research on it.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Warner, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast today. And I know we're barely even scratching the surface. And one of the things that you said that really stuck out to me is that if you're interested and this is a value for you as a clinician, you want to get more competent in this area, this can't be something that you occasionally dig into. It should really become something that you're committed to and spending, regular time kind of working on. And so if you had a couple of pieces of actionable intel, a couple of pieces of advice for our listeners about how they could, continue to learn about the let up model, addressing microaggressions in clinical work, what might be just a couple of pieces of advice that you could give?
Mm-hmm. So I often like to give a quote, and it goes like this: silence is compliance and only enhances and encourages injustice in the world. Oftentimes, when we experience, conflict, we try to shut down, right? And we feel that engaging, if we have a different ideology or a different viewpoint of someone else, then it's probably easy for us to avoid, right? And we try to teach our patients and not to avoid, and we teach our patients how to approach difficult situations. it's important for us as clinicians, as culturally aware clinicians, that we also approach discomfort, that we also do not shut down and be quiet when we hear injustice, or we hear a discriminatory remark, or we hear a microaggression, or maybe we commit a microaggression, within therapy, within our personal lives, within the workplaces. And ultimately, APA indicates that, as providers, we should be consistently engaging in continued education and consistently trying to grow, as human beings and as culturally competent or culturally aware, providers. So it's really important to know that if we do want to provide the best care for our patients, that we implement, we try to engage in self-awareness. We try to engage in continual diversity trainings and discussion, and try to maybe start with, our in-group. Maybe start with people we're close with. Maybe that be our spouse or our children, or somebody that we can trust, and try to have these uncomfortable conversations with them. And then maybe we can start to branch out and start to implement what we learned, with our patients, with our coworkers, with our supervisors, et cetera. So I think it's a continual journey that we need to engage in. No one's going to fully get to this point in which they're culturally competent, right? We have to always learn. I know for me, I'm always just trying to read and trying to learn about different cultural groups. And that's going to help me not just be a better person, not to be just more inclusive within my workplace, but also better treat the patients that I serve. Because we see people from all different backgrounds, right? No matter if they're in the military, no matter their gender identity, their racial, ethnic identity, everybody comes from different places. Everyone has different upbringings. Everyone comes to therapy with a layer of different identities. And we have to be able to enhance our muscles and our comfort around engaging in productive, meaningful dialogue with them when these things come up, but also when, it's covert and it's under the surface. And maybe our patients are trying to tell us something, and we need to be aware of when to try to probe and try to engage with them, right? When it comes to diversity, when it comes to cultural identity, et cetera.
Time to practice what we preach, what we ask our clients to do. Put yourself in uncomfortable situations so you can grow. That's what we need to do also. Yes. Well, I wanted to thank you again so much, Dr. Warner, for coming on our podcast and for those really important pieces of advice. And thank everybody for listening today.
Thank you so much for your expertise. I feel really, really, what's the word? I feel like I've got work to do, and I appreciate the push.
Yes, we all do. So Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, rate, and join in on the conversation in the comments.
Until next time.